And what I feel like I hear on the road is a lot of people who say government is not working for them. And they may not like the way that Donald Trump is actually doing something about that. But what I don't think I've ever heard is Democrats actually start from that premise and say, here are the things we're going to try to do to make government work better for you.
Anyway, hold on. I'm joining the video call with Astead right now, and we're going to get started on some of these issues. We're going to be talking about a bunch of the stuff, including but not limited to what I'm talking about currently. Hold on. Astead?
Yo, how are you?
Hey, what's going on? I thought you were going to be in your car. What happened?
No, I'm saying I'm finally back home, you know?
Oh, nice.
He's giving me my life back in like some way, so at least I'm back.
Okay. You wanna put your camera on landscape so that I can...
Is that better?
Wait. Oh,
Okay,
boom. There it is. That's perfect. What? Oh, nope. It still went horizontal for some reason. You might need to... If you put it... Oh, no, it's good. It's good. All right. Perfect. Perfect. Perfect.
Let me do this. All right, here we go.
Damn, your nails are looking insane.
I started one of my friends convinced me this year to start getting manicures, and it's been a real relaxation piece. So just, you know, me and Caleb Williams on our clear gel tips.
That's crazy. That's like my shit is busted. It's so bad. My dad is always trying to get me to go out and get a manicure and a pedicure. I've never done it. I don't know.
Listen,
why.
I gotta say, it changed the game this year. So one endorsement here.
Hell yeah. All right. So Astead Herndon, everybody, of the New York Times. You might have seen him on CNN numerous times, host of the Run Up podcast, a fantastic reporter that has been accurately communicating some of the issues that have been happening. I think your voice is very important to have in mainstream media, especially now when I feel like a lot of, dare I say, the consultant class is utilizing this opportunity to basically defend themselves and defend their positions and defend their strategies, many of which are former Republicans, by the way, which is always interesting, to claim that the Kamala Harris campaign actually failed because she said Latinx too much, which is weird because I never heard her say that ever.
Yeah.
Or that they were too leftist and too woke, as a matter of fact. So
it's the same hobby horses a lot of these people have done for a while. I mean, for so many of that group, I think you're right to kind of name it as the consultant class. Every loss ends in the same lessons. And it's the lesson to blame the left. And I just don't think that's credible this time around. As we talked about the last time on here, she made a kind of explicit pivot to the center that wasn't just with Liz Cheney or refusing to break with Biden on Gaza. But when we talked to Mark Cuban, he said that was his big difference with her, from her to Biden, is that he felt that the Biden administration wasn't open to them and that she was calling CEOs and she was calling Silicon Valley and crypto and leaning into kind of big business. And so I don't think anybody can say that they ran to the left. Yeah. It's the opposite.
Yeah. So I read parts of the Atlantic piece that came from Biden World because, like, there are numerous different camps here, right? You have the consultant class that are, you know, Clinton heads or Obama heads that are defending their own version of like what went wrong. And many of them are basically running the same route, which is ironic. They all sound like a Ben Shapiro video from 2016. Like the things that I've heard Joe Scarborough say about like how his daughter is afraid to speak up in college campuses because of free speech or whatever is just like, I guess it's shocking to hear that on MSNBC so prominently in display. But on the Atlantic piece, you had the Biden World also running their own version of events, saying that like Biden could have won potentially, which demonstrably was not true. So not true that he had to drop out. But one part of that I saw that you just brought up as well with respect to Mark Cuban was that the Biden administration, in my opinion, ran an anti-corporate populist administration, more so than even the Barack Obama administration. This was something that I talked about quite a bit. And there was one assessment that I actually agreed with in the Atlantic piece where they said Tony West, Kamala Harris's brother-in-law, came on to the campaign and directly told her to cut it out. Tony West is a Uber lobbyist. Or I believe, is he an executive at Uber or lobbyist for Uber?
I'm pretty sure like chief, one of their senior officers. Like he's not just, he's a big boy there.
Yeah, Tony West, big boy at Uber, came up to Kamala Harris directly and told her, cut it out with this anti-corporate stuff. We want corporations and like corporate, corporate executives to be on our side, be on the campaign side. And if you do this like anti-corporate messaging, if you hit this anti-corporate slant, you're going to get punished. And she cut it out. And then she brought in, oh my God, Mark Cuban to calm the masses and to say like, no, like corporations, like Kamala Harris loves corporations. There was all this back and forth about like Lena Khan. Is she going to get fired? Is she not going to get fired? That like drew a lot of discourse. And it always felt like they were just pointing to the donors and being like, don't worry, don't worry. We will not harm you. And I think that played a role in her campaign. I think that not focusing on that sort of stuff that plays very well to the broader public was another misstep, in my opinion.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think that when you look back, there's the macro failure of the Democratic Party's refusal to break with Biden 2 years ago, and there's the micro failure of Kamala Harris's refusal to do it in the last 3 months. And both of those matter a ton. I think the first one matters a little more, in my opinion, but the second one was the last opportunity they had to really fix and understand the desire for change, the distaste with the administration, the unpopularity, and they just refused all of the evidence on that front. And I think what you're pointing out is important, but as someone who's covered Harris for a while, this has always been the kind of contradiction from her. She has, kind of progressive roots in some senses and a real connection with, I think, a progressive academic nonprofit ecosystem, even through
Oh,
her
yeah.
sister Maya Harris. But at the same time, Tony West is a huge influence for them too, and they have a lot of ties with kind of California corporate dollars, the kind of big donor ecosystem of Democrats also. And so she's always been someone who's less than choosing one side or the other, has tried to be both at the same time. And we saw that really not work for her in the 2019 presidential race.
Yeah.
And I would say it kind of didn't work for them now either. And I just don't, I just think that you can't backdoor your way into the presidency. Like, and people want a sense of who you are, what you stand for. And some of that requires hard choices. And honestly, in my opinion, I think the Democrats overrate how much of that is ideological and how much of that is just about like authenticity, period. Like, there's one way to view Bernie Sanders as a hard progressive, and there's other way to view him as like guy who talks about broken system and gets money out of politics, and that's not really easily on right or left, period.
Yeah.
And I think that they just refuse to see that there's some stuff that they could say and own that speaks to people's distaste for how government is right now that they just don't do. But I think you're pointing on the important point. Maybe the reason they don't do it is because they don't want to. They want, because the donors don't want that message, right? Like,
Yeah.
the corporate class doesn't want that message. It will require pissing them off. And if you're not willing to do that, then yeah, you're going to have to try to be everything to everyone.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's like, ironically, the worst instincts on both ends. You're burning the candle from both ends. Like when you do the NGO style, like corporate, when you apply the corporate heuristic of like I guess I don't want to say DEI culture because I feel like that term is very loaded.
Yeah.
But like there is a level of inauthenticity associated with like hyper targeting marginalized groups, which Kamala Harris didn't really do, but she had done that in 2019. And I think it haunted her throughout this campaign where it's very aesthetic, it's very optics focused, and it's not necessarily like even identifying or really looking for adequate solutions to any of the problems facing.
Like, representation's a big example here. I think even more than DEI culture, the good faith version of that is how Democrats have talked. I think when they talk to people of color mostly in the last 4 years, they're mostly talking about including them in elite spaces. And that's that kind of, the Biden administration is the most diverse ever. Harris is VP, Ketanji Brown Jackson is Supreme Court Justice. And I think that that's a fine message for some people of color. But I think, to your point, it's not a material change. And so when you get results like this, where a group of people clearly want something different, and that cuts across demographic groups, I think you have to ask yourself, like, were the messages that they were giving, particularly people of color, landing? And I just think the answer is clearly not for a lot, not for as many as they needed. And so much of that, I think, is a holdover from the Obama administration, where they basically still have the idea that if we appeal on this kind of like racial essentialism lens first, then we'll, in the end, we'll win over Latinos, we'll win over Black folks, we'll win over these groups. And I just think that like more and more they talked about race without talking about change, you know? It was just race for race sake. And I think that applies to a lot of things. Race, gender, sexuality is the thing they talked about the most. And so I said this like in another place, but they have to expand the ways they think about identity. And if it's just landing with them now that people of color who come from different places have different ideas,
Yeah.
that Latinos that have different countries of origin come to politics in a different way, like that is an embarrassing late game realization.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think obviously like left unexamined was the same resilient anger that everyone, regardless of their racial background across the board, felt towards these institutions, right? Like
Yeah.
the infallibility of our institutions and the defense of our institutions and centering the conversation around like civility and protecting said institutions when on the ground people felt like it was not working for them.
Yes.
I think
Yes.
was such a hollowed out message that just did not resonate with many people, which I think many of which just stayed at home. Like a lot of people are talking about people flipping party loyalty, right?
Yeah.
But I think that, and we'll have a better assessment of how much that happened eventually when all the votes are tabulated and counted. But what actually is interesting, I think, or what actually is like very illuminating here is the number of people that just sat at home, that just did not go out. Like one thing that you and I had talked about on numerous occasions throughout this truncated campaign was that we both expressed somewhat of a fear that Kamala Harris was going to have the bottom fall out. Like the normal groups that would come out and vote for the Democratic Party that are like an active part of the coalition were going to hear her consistently communicating towards this like moderate position, dare I say right-wing position. We're going to not respond to this message in a positive way and just choose to sit this one out. And that is precisely, it seems, what happened, especially in comparison to past performance in 2020, which was a COVID election. So obviously it's different. There was always going to be higher turnout across the board. But it seems like Donald Trump did not hemorrhage as many of his base of support from that time frame as the Democratic Party did.
I don't think there was anyone who came into this, like even before we know how many votes there are in total, the fact that Donald Trump won the popular vote means that they can't really tell themselves this is just one type of story. Like he increased in rural areas and the drop off in urban areas is one that is so noticeable. The collapse in places like New York City, the fact that AOC is getting more raw vote totals than Kamala Harris in her district is a searing indictment of people who see and live in Democratic places. And so I think that I saw some stats about how Kamala Harris did in her own home county in
And
Alameda.
Richie Torres got less votes.
Yeah, and so I'm saying like there's these stories that are really clear for them that I think has to tell them that their message is just not completely not hitting for even the people who see and understand Democrats the most. And I wouldn't really went back to the democracy argument because I think it's an important one. Like they speak from this place where they act like there's this shared assumption of America's ideals and that Donald Trump is this aberrant figure who broke them. And what I feel like I hear on the road is a lot of people who say government is not working for them. And they may not like the way that Donald Trump is actually doing something about that. But what I don't think I've ever heard is Democrats actually start from that premise and say, here are the things we're going to try to do to make government work better for you.
Yeah.
And so like, there's a way that's completely outside of ideology, right, left, whatever, that they could say, hey, this is about money in politics or gerrymandering or term limits or whatever you want to do, like about that kind of front, just something that actually speaks to people's concerns, that they don't think a current system is actually responsive to people, is something they never really did. What they did was the kind of Liz Cheney version of the argument, which says that the American democracy or political system was going fine until Donald Trump blew it up and January 6th happened.
And without examining why people wanted Donald Trump to blow up the system in 2016 when he won.
That should have been the informing original point. right? Like Donald Trump has never been the person of stability, right? The disruption was already chosen one time. And they just had a failure of belief to think people would do it again. I was saying this on CNN, but I can't help but think about when I went to the DNC winter meeting in early 2023. This is the first gathering of party officials after the midterms. And they were putting South Carolina first in the primary order, a thing Joe Biden asked for, not even Jim Clyburn, but Joe Biden asked for that specifically because it would make his road to nomination easier. And we were asking them, why are you doing this with the evidence of Joe Biden's age being such a problem, his unpopularity, inflation? And what we got was, people would to me, only some people would even acknowledge those signs. But of the ones who did, there was a belief that Donald Trump would be inherently unelectable because January 6th and the legal problems. And so it did. So some of them even said it doesn't actually matter this time around because we're going to be going up against someone who the American people already see as incapable of holding the office again. But there was nothing that was actually telling them that was true except their own hunch, you know? And so it was such a big risk on the party's part. And even in their own strategy at that point, they were basically banking on the fact that when people tuned in a couple weeks before the race was over, that they would be freaked out by the reality of Donald Trump. And at the minimum, that was a strategy that just hampered them into only one way of winning. And it just blew my mind that nobody decided to question it. Like, whether Joe Biden wants to act in his own interest or not is one thing, but these are all political actors with agency. And before the midterms happened, there was a discussion in a lot of political circles about if someone was going to run against Biden and his mass unpopularity and the fact that he was too old, right? Like it's not like they didn't have these thoughts. It's just that they suppressed them once it didn't match up with their own political ambition. And so the only thing that I feel like I've been trying to do in the reporting side is like try to tell folks like this was not inevitable. This was not like some march that ended with Donald Trump. It had to end with Donald Trump. I think it was made easier to make I think the Democrats made that pathway a lot easier because they lived in their own reality and just frankly just assumed it was true by just agreeing with them amongst themselves.
Yeah, I noticed this when I had for the first time in my career like direct insider access to the DNC when I went to the
Yep.
DNC, and I recognized that it was actually quite alarming to me where it felt like one, their attitude did not match with the reality that I had seen. Right. They were doing victory laps with the initial momentum that Kamala Harris had gotten, making it seem like this was in the bag. But beyond that, I also noticed that it is a bubble. It was the first time I remember thinking, this is the least I've been aware of what is happening in the world when I'm directly in the center of what people are paying attention to. And that really stayed with me. And I think that is part of the reason why I really like talking to journalists such as yourself who by trade go out to the real world and talk to real voters. Like, Dave Weigel does this as well.
Yep.
Like you have a dramatically different perspective than I think the type of perspective that op-ed writers who never really leave New York or never really leave DC have, because you're seeing what like normal human beings are suffering on. You're seeing like where the material harm is and what their experiences look like.
Yeah.
And
I had this like formative moment after the 2022 midterms where I remember being at Christmas with a friend's family. And this was like, this is like a working class family who were like all Black and Latino. And they were asking me like, okay, they, doing the like, ask their friend who's a reporter, like, so what's going to happen in the presidential election? And I was like, oh, it's probably going to be Biden and Trump. And, I just said it kind of flippantly because in our political ecosystem, everybody knew that, right? And so I was like, it's probably going to be a Biden-Trump rematch. And there was a shock in this room. Everyone was completely shocked. And it wasn't just a shock about Donald Trump, which I had heard before, because of January 6th, because of all that stuff. But everyone was shocked that Joe Biden would be running for reelection. And there was a feeling that, like, didn't he tell us he wasn't going to do that? And I know that there is like questions about whether that promise was explicit, but it was certainly implicit, right? And I think that so many people held on to that, and they did, and that was the reason they talked themselves into a Biden vote in 2020.
yeah,
And I had that moment at the midterms where I was like, oh, the surprise in this election is not just about Trump's return. It's about a dual distaste for the candidates, and that is reflective of a political system that people aren't liking.
Yeah.
And it was this moment for me that I really informed the work we did over 2023, because I was seeing this like completely disconnected conversation between all the insiders we talk to and I'm around for work and my life. And in my life, everyone was being like, "Are you serious?" There's no way this is happening again. In the journalistic and political world, everyone was just kind of like silently marching toward this thing.
Yeah.
And so I just feel as if, to your point, like it can be such a bubble because the people who end up making the decisions are people who are oftentimes completely disconnected from the electorate. Like when Joe Biden's deciding whether or not to drop out, the electorate is not in the room at all.
Yeah.
And that's been one of my big realizations in this process is like, oh, take those voices and bring them to them, because you can't just assume that they're asking those questions. Like in a lot of cases, they aren't.
Yeah, absolutely. There are a couple different things that I wanted to point to here. In our conversations, I still, while criticizing Kamala Harris's campaign and like the active messaging that they were engaging in and how clearly was not resonating with voters, especially in the swing states, given the polling data readily available that showed that after $30 million of ads in particular TV markets, like the polls had not swung in her direction at all, which implied that, in my opinion, that the message was not resonating because it wasn't a good message. But in spite of that, I still maintain the belief, looking at past performance of high propensity voters, the normal whites that were grossed out by all of the trans panic, crime panic narratives that they just didn't really subscribe to, and that did care about, at the very least, like the civility narratives. Looking at the 2022 midterms specifically, I thought that this older 2016 Democratic agenda, a statement from Chuck Schumer, was potentially going to hold in the upcoming election. I'm going to share my screen with you real quick, and I want to show you this, and we can watch it together. And I want to know if you also agree that maybe this was a failure, that the progressive people that had been very critical of this back in 2016 can maybe now turn around and say it. Let's take a look.
This is the second point. For every blue-collar Democrat we will lose in Western PA, we will pick up 2-3 moderate Republicans in the suburbs of Philadelphia. And you can repeat that in Ohio and Illinois and Wisconsin. The voters who are most out there figuring out what to do are not the blue-collar Democrats. They are the college-educated Republicans who lean Republican or are independent and in the suburbs.
So this is the method, right? Like they very actively communicated that this was the method in 2016. It failed. And that in the aftermath of that failure, it seems like with the COVID situation, there was a brief moment, a brief glimmer of hope for the Democrats to say, no, actually it did work. See, Joe Biden won by 42,000 votes across key states, but still won overall. And then the 2022 primaries that was supposed to deliver a resounding defeat to a president that was overseeing historic levels of inflation actually turned into a red puddle. So I think that really solidified the Democratic Party's position that this was the method, and that's part of the reason why they ran in this direction.
Yeah, I agree. I think that specifically you're talking about bad lessons they took from midterms. And I think this is important for like folks to get, and something that I think Nate Cohn at the Times helped me understand a lot. Because I would ask him, like, we're seeing these special elections, we're seeing this midterm electorate, like you're seeing abortion rights really take precedent. And he laid out for us on the run up, like the composite of people who vote for presidential elections is completely different. And how they're thinking is pretty much fully dictated by who's at the top of the ticket. And so it's not a thing that you can take a direct lesson from the midterms to the presidential. And so part of the reason we were asking those questions, even back in early 2023 at that winter meeting I'm talking about, is because it was very clear that the midterm results changed everything for Joe Biden and Democrats. when the folks who follow the numbers and the kind of the pollsters and all those folks were saying that's not equal, those are not extrapolation you should make. And I think this is the problem with kind of what he's talking about. And even if that suburban person came to Democrats in 2018 or 2022, it's not set that that person's going to stay with them, right? Like it's not that they're not like a full member of the party. And I think what we saw over the last 4 years was that Joe Biden, like the distaste for Democrats, just became greater than the fear of Donald Trump. And so in seating that blue collar worker in for the sake of winning that Republican voter, now when that Republican voter flipped back to Donald Trump, they've just lost both. And I think that like that is the thing that I really don't get, is because there could be, and this is where the primary matters so much, because I think that is the way that you really find a message that includes all pieces of that slice. They didn't have an open conversation of where the base wanted to be on immigration or
Yeah.
wanted to be on all of those issues. They didn't fight it out. And so at the minimum, there was a feeling of unheardness, I think, from a certain group of Democrats. And I don't think they're wrong in feeling that. Like, I don't think the party acted with those people in mind.
I mean, there's an even greater example of this that we also had talked about, that the Democratic Party's attitude on Israel Palestine was going to be a deciding factor in a state like Michigan, for example. And when I kept seeing the way that they were operating, including like, kicking out an Arab delegate that they'd invited, right, to a speech, and sending Richie Torres to Michigan to tell the Jewish voters there that, like, don't worry, we actually love Israel and we don't care about these Arabs at all. And then sending Bill Clinton to do like an Itamar Ben-Gvir style speech talking about Judea and Samaria and King David or whatever the fuck. Like, all of that was actively pushing away not just the Arab voters in Dearborn, which is a massive constituency, but beyond the Arab voters in Dearborn, it was clearly very frustrating to a lot of people who did care about this, and plenty of polls showed that reality, and they just openly refused to reckon with it. And as a matter of fact, not only did they openly refuse to reckon with it, they simply were acting like they could win without these constituencies. And I don't know how echo chambered you have to get. Like, I don't know how hard you have to be in the DC bubble, basically, to believe yourself, to believe that this was not you could win without these voters. But it seemed to me at that time that they were like deliberately trying to write out this base of support that had in the past gone to Joe Biden by like 70 to 80%, as a matter of fact. And I think that the one thing that flipped me from, they're deliberately writing out these people and they actively want to give people the permission to like openly be bigoted and openly say, no, only Arabs care about this. This is sectarian violence. It's the classic trope of like, this is 1,000-year religious war. Don't worry about it. You can still vote for the Democrats. Like, that's what I thought they were trying to do. But then I saw Kamala Harris apply the NGO optics style speech only after Donald Trump went to Dearborn, where she, for the first time ever in months, turned around and placed Palestinians and the Lebanese as the victims of violence without immediately contextualizing it as Israel's right to defend itself and the October 7 attacks and Hamas, doing brutal things. Like, that was the first time I ever saw her do that. And that's when it hit me that, like, no, this is DC bubble shit. Like, they genuinely did not realize that this was ineffective messaging until Donald Trump went there and actively courted those Arab votes.
I think you're exactly right. And what they end up doing is losing both sides of the coin. They had drop off among Jewish voters and huge drop off among Arab Palestinian voters. And so, obviously that's going to be a problem for Donald Trump once he has to govern or whatever. But I'm saying what he was a vessel for distaste against the Democratic policy and messaging that was not working. And I would say even more so than kind of revealing the DC bubbleness of it all, I think her refusal to break with Biden specifically on Gaza was the litmus test for, are you different or are you not? You know, like the broader question of like, does she represent a new way forward? Does she represent something that is beyond a different face on the Biden campaign? I think was most clearly articulated when she failed to answer that question on The View.
Oh
And then,
yeah.
like, which was a moment. But then also, I think just generally for young people, for folks who care about that issue, it was like, oh, I'm getting a different person, but I'm getting the same Democratic Party. And it didn't have to be like that. And so I guess one thing I think though is this is where like vision and leadership matters, is because if you seed, I mean, this is one thing I learned in covering these presidential campaigns in the primary in 2019-20, is that it requires a candidate who knows what they believe in, and then a campaign is kind of working from that premise. And so I would say that in that primary, that was true of Bernie, that was true of Warren, that was probably true of Joe Biden too. And they were all had a set of beliefs that really their campaign was working to implement strategically or message wise, whatever. But it wasn't that you were just giving up your beliefs to this weather vane of consultants. And I think one thing that Harris has been fairly guilty of is being more so reflective of where the Democratic Party is than trying to lead the Democratic Party's conversation.
Yeah.
And that's what's true even on criminal justice, an issue she's dedicated her whole career to. And I just think that at some point, that really starts to reflect poorly on you because voters don't have a sense of who you are. And I think, even in interviews and things like that, you're looking for the right answer rather than just saying what you believe in, right? And so I think some of this, when you talk about the kind of consultant class and others, sometimes I'm just baffled that they just aren't working from a premise of what do you actually care about? You know, like it would seem to me that's the easier way to run is to actually set off like a set of beliefs and work from that premise. But for her specifically, that's not what they did. I would say one more thing too. Like if like Joe Biden's refusal to acknowledge his age as an issue starts with his selection of Kamala Harris. Because they knew at that time that a lot of Democrats did not think she was a leader, she was the person to lead the party in the future. And so when I was doing a profile of Kamala Harris last year, one of the big questions I had was, did they pick her with the future in mind? And the answer was kind of no. And
No.
that was from Biden's own people. And
Yeah.
so all I'm saying is like, that's how far they were from reality,
Yeah.
even at that time, is because they were operating from a kind of two-term assumption even back then.
No, it was
And
very
so
selfish.
I'm saying, so like, if like, fine, like, let's say you didn't think Kamala Harris, like, in that selection process, they should have known they were choosing the person who was who was likely
Yeah.
to be the next Democratic standard bearer. And so if you think that's Gretchen Whitmer, choose Gretchen Whitmer. If you
Yeah.
think that's whatever, choose that person. But they didn't do that. They were only basically thinking about how to win the current election. And then I think it plays out between a weird dynamic with the VP because I don't even think she was set up for success,
Oh
honestly.
yeah, no, definitely. This is something that I noticed early on when they made her the border czar, right? That
Right. That's not
is
something you do if you think
no,
the
that's
person's going to
cleanup
be running
duty.
for president.
That's cleanup duty. You put her there specifically because you wanted her to do side quests that were unimaginably bad,
Yes.
and you had
Yes.
no care or consideration in propping her up as
Yes.
the next leader of the Democratic Party. They did that
Yeah.
deliberately,
Yeah.
and I think that was because Biden is a truly spiteful and somewhat selfish person who wanted to become president since 1988 and never gave up on that, and was probably very upset with Barack Obama, who told him not to run in 2016, where he was correct in thinking that he would have won against Donald Trump, because I think Joe Biden would have defeated Donald Trump in 2016, and
Yeah.
he never forgave anybody for that. So he basically cast aside like a lot of the pillars of the Democratic Party, for better or for
Yeah.
worse. And I think that was the reason why he was like, no, it's Biden's time now, you know? And
Yeah, and I think that you're really correctly landing on some of the Biden mythology that's important here. Like, I think one of the things that I learned that I don't really have a full grasp on before I started doing this reporting is just how important the kind of unelected emperors around a candidate are and the stories they kind of tell themselves.
yeah,
And one thing that's really important about the Biden world is they thought, I mean, before this week, they thought that they were kind of unappreciated figures of history. They thought that that Obama did not give them the credit they deserve, that Biden was someone who was completely underestimated, and that they were uniquely positioned to beat Donald Trump as they showed. And that even in the primary leading up to that, people did not see them as being the people, the kind of salt of the earth connectors that they were. And so partly all of that leads to them being so convinced of their own correctness
Yeah.
that I think it stops them from answering the very obvious things that were in front of them. And so I'm like, they can believe all that if they want, but to think that America was electing Biden in 2020 under the assumption of 8 years is just wild to me, you
Yeah.
know? And so partly like that's his decision to run for election. But even before that, I think it's his decision to select Kamala Harris because they should have done something with the knowledge that that person was the very likely next party leader. And if they wanted that to be her, they could have set that person up for success.
But they
And if
didn't
they
want him.
didn't want that to be her, they shouldn't have chose her.
They did not want the vice president to potentially overshadow a very
Yes.
old president, because then it calls into question like how replaceable he is. And I think it was a very well calculated and disastrous decision overall, which I think carried on to Kamala Harris's campaign. I mean, it is without a question that like one of the major issues here, because there have been a lot of incorrect assessments and then there have been some very correct assessments. For example, talking about like no unpopular incumbent president has ever won re-election when people when 60+% of the population is saying that they want change. And Kamala Harris did not represent that change. No unpopular incumbent president has ever won regardless. And Joe Biden was the least popular person. He was out of the trio with Kamala Harris, Donald Trump, and Joe Biden. His disapproval rating was the highest.
Yeah.
It's over at that point, right? So
it's over if you don't acknowledge that. It's over if you don't do, and so all I'm saying is it would be one thing to me if it would be one thing to me if Joe Biden was like a 50-year-old person who was kind of unpopular or whatever. But he had already laid out a possible escape route for this thing where he had said that he would be a bridge to another generation, et cetera, et cetera. And so when we would talk to people, this came up with a voter I talked to 2 weeks ago. She was saying that, like, yes, she's going to vote for Kamala Harris, but she still resents the fact that that is a choice that was put on her rather than the choice that was across the Democratic Party. And no one made that, no one forced that to be true besides Biden, the folks around him, and the lack of political courage for the party at large. Because technically, it's the party's job, right? Like, technically, Biden can say whatever he wants, and other members of the party and the party writ large should be the one responding to voters' concerns. And so that's why we were at the DNC, because I was like, I know you're doing this because Biden wrote a letter telling you to do this. And have you considered that no, people don't want this? And it was just so unfathomable to me that it was not really unfathomable because we know that that's kind of politics. But all I'm saying is they were comfortable even admitting that that was a decision that was made without the public in mind.
Yeah, which is interesting because like now Nancy Pelosi is coming out and openly admitting it. Like if Biden had dropped out sooner, things would be different. We could have had an open primary. And it's like, well, instead of an open primary, what about just a primary, right?
Yeah.
Like how about just a normal primary that wasn't completely shut off because Jamie Harrison and everyone else, which were Biden loyalists for some reason, refused to even acknowledge that like anyone else was going to be the candidate for the reasons that you pointed to. I want to take a step back from the campaign and actually talk about the administration, because obviously this past year of the Biden administration has been mired with, I guess I'm going to use a loose term here, controversy, right? And a lot of discontent. Having said that, however, I think that the Biden administration, I'm doing my best Ezra Klein right now. I'm trying to be like him. Having said that, however, I think the Biden administration did a bunch of remarkable things that I, as a leftist who always feels a level of discontent with the party, was shocked by. Biden's NLRB did a fantastic job. Biden's IRS went after tax dodgers and actually recovered millions of dollars of taxable revenue from tax dodgers. And Biden's FTC, obviously with Lena Khan, had done a a fantastic job as well, going after trust busters, including but not limited to Amazon.
Yep.
And one thing that I always found very strange, including actually something that the media roundly criticized as a disaster, was pulling out of Afghanistan, like demonstrating political courage to do something, even if it was a continuation of Trump's negotiated withdrawal that Trump punished him for quite effectively. Actually, not even quite effectively. I don't think the Trump's Afghanistan withdrawal point was that as prescient as people would suggest it in the media. But the thing that I was always frustrated by, if we go back in time to October 2023, before October 7 and before October 5th, where Biden actually unveiled his right-wing border bill, leading up to that moment, this administration was slated to be the most anti-corporate populist and most progressive from an economic standard administration that I had ever seen in my lifetime. And that includes the Obama administration as well. Biden walked a picket line. That was historic, right? And the UAW stood by him for that reason. Now, these are very important things that Biden did. Why did they not talk about it? I never understood. I mean, I know as someone who covers politics and has been doing this for 10 years, like, Democrats do not campaign year round. Republicans do. And they have this incredible connection with their media ecosystem all the way down to independent content creators and Fox News, certainly. They're always connecting with their base and they're always re-upping their narratives, the Republicans do. Democrats, on the other hand, never chose to actively campaign year round and communicate to the public all of the things that they were doing. One example of this that really frustrated me was the overdose deaths from opiates. The Biden administration is the first administration in the past couple of decades where the number of overdoses from opiates actually declined. Now, fentanyl has been a point of contention nonstop on the Republican side. And yet I never heard from the Biden administration that, like, we actually took a shot at this, and with the, you know, widespread, readily available over-the-counter distribution of Narcan and many other policies, we actually were able to lower opioid overdoses for the first time ever. And it's shocking to me that they never communicated that. It's shocking to me that they never communicated the fact that the Afghanistan withdrawal was, yes, mired in controversy and the media pummeled them, but that it was the right thing to do. It was not only the right thing to do, but that the Republicans cynically weaponized the 13 active duty service members that were killed in the process over and over and over again. And yet 13, while not a single, you know, soldier dying is appropriate, right? But 13 was the final number of the amount of active duty service members that were killed in Afghanistan, because they did successfully withdraw from Afghanistan. Whereas under the Trump administration, 67 soldiers had died in Afghanistan because he never withdrew from Afghanistan. So, like, there are so many gimmies throughout this entire process, throughout this entire administration, where they could have just stood 10 toes down and been like, no, this was the right thing to do. How dare you actually weaponize, death of our beautiful soldiers to try to make this, like, cynical argument, and you know, maybe even sicked Pete Buttigieg as an attack dog on all of the you know, media sources that were yelling at the administration over and over again. He's a fantastic communicator. I don't agree with him ideologically. I'm terrified of him, but, like, you know, he is good at chirping. They never did that with the railroad strike. They shut off the railroad strike, but then they went back to the railroad companies and openly negotiated with them and delivered results for the railroad unions. The only reason why I know that is because I read the union publications. That was the only place that this was communicated.
I mean, I think you bring up a bunch of important points, because it is true that Democrats had come into the Biden administration with the belief that good policy will be good politics, that if they simply do the right thing, quote unquote, that voters will reward them. And so I think it might be a unfortunate lesson that they take from this loss, that though that voters did not respond to that and voters did not reward them electorally for those policies, But what I would say is I think that's a little overly simplistic because even though they were doing good things, it is not as if they had a messenger to sell that progress to Americans. And so when I was out on the road, you would hear people say that Biden's done nothing on climate. And then I would mention the IRA,
Yeah.
and they would, like stuff like that. This would happen all the time, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that he was this filter that people were seeing the administration through. And so even things that would have been defined as quote unquote progress, we're not seeing this progress because the part of politics that's also important besides just doing good things is telling people what you have done and then and
Yes.
getting that to them. And so
Yes.
I don't think they really did that effectively. And I would also say, and this is obviously going to be rich coming from the Times, but they made a very specific war on mainstream media over the past 3, 4 years. And I think that was part of their desire to insulate Biden. And I think it was just a very bad decision because a lot of the things that I think you're talking about are messages they could have taken to traditional and legacy media, are messages that that Biden could have, done. But he was not going out. He was refusing those type of interviews. And they were making a point to say that you all don't matter anymore. And I guess that I just find it really, really like a self-inflicted wound on their part because not only like obviously the media landscape has changed, but a lot of times when narratives are setting in, particularly in those early points of the administration when the public isn't really tuned in, they could have started creating a narrative of their political
Yeah.
accomplishments. And they simply left that on the ground because they wanted to stick it to the New York Times. They wanted to stick it to the Wall Street Journal and all that stuff. And then as those places, including us, were reporting on his unpopularity through things like age, they used their allies to try to say that that was part of some grand mainstream media conspiracy against him.
Yeah.
That the Times publisher was coming down and telling us to ask these questions, which isn't true, right? And so I'm saying it's like both a problem of, I think, the fact that Joe Biden was not a good messenger for even the things that they were doing, and the fact that they were not taking that message to a lot of the more traditional places simply because they thought they were over it. And
Yeah.
so by the time they get to the, Harris campaign side, when she's doing all these podcasts and she's doing all of this type of other stuff, I kind of think they're at a 3-year deficit because either they refused to do it because they didn't want to, or they couldn't do it because Joe Biden couldn't. And either one of those is a bad answer. Like if you don't have the type of messenger who can tell you why the policies that the administration are doing are good, if you can't take that message to the American people and against Republicans, that's the job, like that's
Yeah.
literally the job of the president in the political context. And so the fact that he wasn't up to it, I think frankly just stop them from being able to pitch that story to the public. But I think you're right. That story was there. It was not a policy question. I do think and as I said at the beginning, I think an unfortunate impact might be, though, that they take the lesson that good policy doesn't help them.
Yes.
And so what is the purpose?
Yeah, that is that's precisely the reason why I wanted to talk about this issue, because
Yeah.
I am very fearful that Democrats are either deliberately, cynically, or unwillingly going to learn the wrong lesson. They're going to look at this and be like, what are you talking about? Biden was incredibly progressive, and look how the voters rewarded him.
Right.
Voters
Right,
obviously
exactly.
don't care about progressive, a progressive legislative agenda. And there was certainly, I'm not even saying like the Biden administration did everything perfect, right? Like it's shocking that it was someone like myself who was quite adversarial with the Democratic administration, who still is honest enough to like openly examine the things that they've done and compare it to prior administrations. Like I'm one of the only major outlets, I guess, as an independent content creator that regularly spoke about not only Lena Khan, it's like me and the Majority Report. Like we were some of the only places where you could hear some of the accomplishments of Joe Biden. And I, like I said, there is a wipeout after October, the month of October, where he, interestingly enough, unveiled his right-wing border bill. And then also October 7 happened and he bear hugged Netanyahu. But like, it was always shocking that they just did not, I guess they were just like truly terrified of the right-wing animus that they would cultivate or the donor pressure that they would get if they just came out openly as like an anti-corporate populist administration.
And I remember asking some Democrats, again, at the beginning of 2023, like, what changes then? All right, if he's unpopular right now, what's going to give? And they said, oh, the policy accomplishments will set in, and that will kind of change the narrative about this administration, and people will become more happy with Biden. And that gave us like, okay, so when does that need to happen before the alarm bells kind of kick off? And though I used to ask that question to a bunch of people, and we blew past all of those deadlines. Folks would say the summer, they would say the end of the year, they would say the beginning of 2024, all of this, and it didn't change. None of it was changing. And even though the actions did not change, they did not they did not take that as a sign that the unpopularity was deep rooted, nor did they do anything particularly different. But I really think that it's a huge messenger issue. Like the Biden we saw at that debate stage is not a messenger who could have told the country why Lena Khan should be defended, right? And
Yeah.
so
No, he
I
wasn't the
guess I'm
guy for
saying
sure. He's too
he wasn't
old.
the guy. And so partly it's like even the strategy is working around the fundamental problem, which is that he wasn't the guy. And so I think one of the things that might come from this though is if I put on my Democratic consultant brain, I bet you a lot of them are going to say, what's the purpose of pissing off our donors for Lena Khan if we aren't rewarded for it?
Yeah.
And I just think that that is a very convenient explanation for a certain group of folks, but it would not surprise me if that's where they land.
Yeah, no, that is exactly what I think is happening and exactly what I think is going to happen. I think that there are a lot of careerist people with like inherently and genuinely right-wing attitudes about the way that the economy is supposed to work. And this is their authentic belief, right? They're not just like saying they're pro neoliberalism. They are pro neoliberalism. And then outside of that, this is, I think, the reason why they want to maintain their careers within the Democratic Party's infrastructure as like consultants. So they're rushing to television. They're rushing to every TV network they can to talk about how, Kamala Harris wasn't sufficiently pro-Israel enough, or which is an insane thing to say. Like I liken that directly to QAnon. And I was shocked that like David Axelrod and Van Jones were talking, were openly saying that in direct response to like what the exact opposite was happening in reality in places like Michigan specifically, or they were too woke, that Kamala Harris was far too woke, or that even the anti-trans ads, right, that the Republican Party routinely pumped into every TV market, that by my estimation, in a country where 64% of the population, regardless of whatever kind of like underlying implicit transphobic opinions that they might have, still believe that trans people are being disproportionately discriminated against.
Yeah.
That kind of messaging might be effective for like, Matt Walsh's fan base, but that is extremely online. It is extremely online, and it's not the type of message that like causes people to go out and vote. And it's not like Kamala Harris was like defending trans people outwardly anyway throughout the entire campaign. And yet they're now talking about how wonderful that ad was, how successful that ad was, both on the Republican side as they're running victory laps, and even on the Democratic side, where I talked to a bunch of consultants off camera, off the record, where they also genuinely thought that was a good ad. Like they were shocked when I tried to describe to them, like, no, this kind of stuff didn't work in 2022. And this kind of stuff just does not work. It might prime up like a certain minor, tiny percentage of the base that already has this like incredible amounts of outward transphobia. But for most people, they just kind of find it to be weird.
Yeah.
Right? They find it odd.
Also and I think that like the Republican attacks work better when you aren't laying out a competing vision, right? Like, and so I remember in the profile that I had about Harris last year, one of the lines was that she had, been a vessel or a vacuum of negative space, and that for supporters and detractors to fill as they choose, because she's refusing to do so herself. And so I'm saying part of the reason that they were susceptible to some of those Republican attacks was because they're not defining themselves in a clear way. And so I also think like it's weird to me that they think that it is an easier solution to throw trans kids under the bus than to say that money in politics they should get rid of money in politics, right? Like there are so many things that actually clearly cut across groups that clearly motivate people, that make it clear that you understand that politics doesn't work for folks in the way that they want. And it's just not that they're doing it. I'm noticing how dark I am. I'm gonna turn on the light.
Yeah, I don't know what happened. Your apartment is crazy nice, by the way. I'm not like pocket watching or anything, but it's like very, very tasteful.
I got like a crazy pandemic deal, and I made apartment therapy, and those are my two big successes in life. And so yes,
it's incredibly tastefully decorated. You have like the perfect amount of plants and everything.
I appreciate this. Thank you.
Yeah. No, you always got great style too. So, you know, that's another, I'm giving you your well-deserved props on that.
Thank you. Like it's been a wild one, but I feel like really completed by the end of this year. Like I think that we've been on this journey, and one of the things that's been hard is like I don't know how to cover politics without being out in the world.
Yeah.
And so, like, I remember after the last 2020 race, I came back and I was like, oh, I haven't spent any time at home. I want to have a real apartment that reflects my taste and interest. Like, I'm going to make an intention to do that. But even this time around, like, frankly was on the road all the time because I think, to your point, like, it's impossible to really get a sense of the way this stuff is landing without being there. And I just think the disconnect between campaigns and DC and parties is so big right now that like it requires travel. For me, it like requires, if you're going to do it in a journalistic way, like it requires getting that kind of direct sourcing because the assumptions of what is hitting is becoming like, it's worse and worse. Like, in my opinion, like there should not be that many reporters at a campaign event, you know?
Yeah.
Like at this point, you know, the people coming there are a very specific type. You can get the message from watching television. Like the amount of journalistic energy that goes to following the candidate every place, we know is not predictive of result or anything like that. Campaign stops don't even show that. And so I just think that one of the things that has been a lesson I've taken, and I think a benefit of like a newspaper, is a belief about being out in the world. And I think it's really served our work.
Yeah. There was a couple things. I don't know how much time you have. It's always wonderful to have you.
I can do a couple more minutes.
Okay, perfect. So there was a couple other things that I wanted to talk about. So one of the things that a lot of people do is like point to correct analysis, but I think they end up missing the broader picture. And the correct analysis on this campaign, outside of like Biden, offering the worst possible situation to an incoming campaign that was supposed to replace him in such a short time frame with Kamala Harris, was also the obvious reality that Kamala Harris is a black woman in a country that is, of course, still very much racist and sexist. And while that is a real issue, right, while that is certainly going to be a hurdle that the campaign must clear, I was of the mindset that the way to clear that would be by becoming an authentic and earnest communicator who could present themselves that way and also make up for it with like decent policies that meet people where they're at, including the economic hardship that they were experiencing. And we've talked, of course, about Kamala Harris's opportunity economy narratives, or how much she loves small businesses and how she was going to offer $50,000 in tax cuts to small businesses, to new startups and whatnot, and how I think devastatingly bad of a message that was. But one thing I wanted to ask you is like, do you feel like people are missing the forest for the trees here, where they are focusing on the obvious like racist and misogynistic tendencies of the population? Because like what frustrates me about that argument, and I hear this, like there was a community member earlier today talking about how like he goes to Howard and his classmates are like devastated and they are repeating this as well. And I have black content creator friends in this space who are very progressive, who are also focusing on this. And the thing I worry rather about this narrative festering is that the solution then is to only run a white man. And I think that's silly. Like I don't think that we should be shutting off like potentially black or brown women from their political ambitions of running for the highest office, specifically because like, oh, sorry, we just have, America's just like too misogynistic, too racist. So I wanted to hear what your opinion on that is.
Well, first thing I think about is back to the 2020 primary, and this stuff does have big impacts because the lesson of Hillary Clinton was so taken as one of sexism. Clearly, I remember in that primary when people talked about electability, they were really just talking about white madness. They were just talking about that the only candidate who could eventually go up against Donald Trump would have to be someone who, when they would say electable, they really meant white guy.
Yeah.
And like that helped Joe Biden get the nomination for sure.
Yeah.
And I think partly folks aren't really seeing, to your point, how that narrative puts those people in a box. And
Yeah.
so we're not thinking about Hillary Clinton or we're thinking about Kamala Harris. We are just thinking about them through their lens of identity. I also think the map is too broad and sweeping to really say it's just one thing. So, like, in the same way, I wouldn't just say it's racism or sexism. I wouldn't say it's Latino men, or I wouldn't say it's white women. I wouldn't say it's black men. I think it's all the above. I think that there was a drop off from the administration that cut across so many groups that you can't really just say it was one of those things. But when I also think about my own reporting, we did an episode of the show that was about young men in Gen Z. We went to a University of Wisconsin football game, and we talked to all of these tailgating young men and women about the gender gap and how they're thinking about the election. And one thing that was really clear to me, and I think you've talked about this before, is a group of young men who are increasingly in an ecosystem that talks to them about masculinity from this right wing lens.
Yeah.
And so you would have these guys. I mean, one of these guys was like, "Oh, I logged on to X yesterday." And he was like, I had to delete my account because every time I get on, I'm just pushed these messages. He was talking about this anti circumcision ad being his last kind of straw. And he was like, I'm sick of this, right? And then there was a bunch of
An
other guys.
honorable cause. We are intactivists in this
And
community.
there was other guys who were talking about how Donald Trump was this model of masculinity, how, all of the kind of businessman success things, but also just like the fact that he pissed women off was an attractive quality to them. There was a guy who told us he thought a woman should be president because he thinks that men built the country, right? And so I think that if the place in which I saw it matter most clearly in results is that there's very clearly a shift among young men that brought them closer to a Republican Party. And I think a lot of that language has been based in the kind of Me Too backlash, has been based in the kind of traditional masculinity return. And they would talk about how they found the left and liberals to be framing masculinity as toxic. And
Yeah.
that came up and that type of thing. And so that makes me think that there is certainly an impact obviously to sexism. There's certainly an impact to a lot of the messages about gender that have filtered down to those people in particular. But I don't think it's true to say this is a reason why she lost. And to your point, I think in saying that, you actually create the conditions for those type of people not to be able to win again. And I
Yeah.
think that's really dangerous. I just think I don't think the lesson of 2016 and 2024 is that a woman can't be president. But I do think a lesson is that, there are ways in which identity matters in politics. And I think that we know that. But I would say in just the ways that Harris and Clinton have lost, we've seen women win, historic races in a lot of other places.
Yeah.
And so I think there's a Democratic bench that I remember talking to Elizabeth Warren about this. She was saying that the benefit that younger women in the party have is that there are so many of them, they're not forced to fit into a mold and that they are freer to be themselves. And I think that type of authenticity matters as they come up. And so we're still dealing with politicians at the presidential level who have been shaped in the mold of the Clinton era, shaped in the mold of the early 2000s, and I think the people coming up are post Trump and they behave and they go about things in a different way. And I think that that matters a lot. One thing I would say is I haven't told you the story, but Kamala Harris's second debate in the presidential race in 2020, the debate after she kind of went at Biden for busing, she was a total different person. She was and it was kind of weird. Everyone was like, wait, she just went at him last time. Now she's super jokey and smiley and all this stuff and was not going on the offensive altogether. And I remember asking her consultants, whoa, and campaign people, what was that? And they told me they were fearful about her being stereotyped or kind of branded as an angry Black woman, as a hard charging Black woman. Whatever. And one of the things I thought at that time, and I still think now, is there's ways that those kind of consultants can presume you have to be and take you away from who you are. Because if there's anything I know about Kamala Harris, it's that she's a fairly direct Black woman. She's a hard-charging Black woman. That's a prosecutor. That's actually
Yeah.
the times in which I think she makes the most sense. You can see that on the debate stage. And so there's a prism sometimes of who you need to be to work. That's, I think the party needs to blow up and lean more into letting people be their authentic selves, particularly in the Trump era, than be who the focus groups, the consultants tell
Yeah.
you need to be. And I think that matters most. That falls the hardest on women and people of color.
Oh,
And
yeah.
they will tell them that certain parts of their identity are incompatible with the electorate, when I honestly think the electorate is more willing to forgive people. Not forgive is not the right word. The electorate is more willing to accept people who they have a clear sense of who they are.
Yes. I'll give you an example. Tim Walz.
For sure.
When Tim Walz has a noticeable market difference when talking about offering healthcare, paid family leave, fixing the housing market, versus when he's talking about foreign policy and is like nuclear first strike, letting Israel nuclear first strike Iran, or even when it comes to immigration, like you can tell that is him trying to communicate what people have told him to say, and the passion isn't there, and it takes away from his authenticity, which has caused him to be such a fantastic communicator of even Kamala Harris's policies overall throughout the entire campaign trail. And this is a guy who does have a pretty solid anti-war foreign policy record in Congress. So I think when you think about that, it's very obvious, like exactly what you're saying is happening to every single person within the Democratic Party, where they're like, do not say anything out of step, do not say anything out of line, or if you do have an out of line moment, it has to be like, clearly focus tested.
I was thinking about I forget the person's name, but the big federal execution that took place a month ago, and how Kamala Harris, one of the things that has been most clear through her career is that she was anti-death penalty. She was anti-death penalty like before kind of the prosecutors of that type were. She took a lot of political heat for it. And then you're running for president in a moment where people are trying to get a sense of who you are, and you don't say anything about it as the party's removing anti-death penalty language from the agenda. And I think that's one of the things where you can say, okay, like they're trying to project themselves as tough on crime or whatever, and they may think that being against the death penalty is like insufficiently tough. But one thing it is Kamala Harris's history, right? And so sometimes I'm like, I don't really understand the choices here, because it doesn't seem to me like the political benefit from backing off and kind of seeming like you're flip-flopping or being inauthentic is worth it. And what you could do is tell a consistent story about yourself and ask people to accept that. And I just think that there is some level of honesty they need to deal with, that the kind of like Frankensteining of a perfect candidate isn't actually working, right? Like Barack Obama wasn't just a consultant collector. He was an early opposition to the Iraq War, right? Like he had an authentic position that people came to him with that gave him validation as an outsider or someone who wasn't thinking about the establishment. And so I'm saying, like, whether you morph into that in office, as a lot of folks do, is another thing. But one thing I don't get is like they will have people like Tim Walz arrive to the point by being who they are, and then once they're in the position, try to change who they are. And I don't really think that works.
It certainly doesn't. And yeah, I think that you can see that with the individual approval ratings of candidates or people who have campaigned in the past or people who have won their races. Like there's a reason I think that Bernie Sanders, regardless of whether or not you agree with his worldview, is a profoundly popular congressperson in a sea of very unpopular congresspeople. And that is because he is authentically himself, and he has always communicated his desires openly and has demonstrated messaging discipline on it. And I think that plays a massive role, like regardless of policy, right?
Yes.
Like,
but can I say something about Bernie
huge.
though? His numbers in his reelection were pretty bad.
Yeah, no,
and
he got worse.
It reminds me, though, of how age can complicate some of this stuff. I think it's similar to a story of Biden, where you can be consistent. I think Biden actually had a record of consistency that most Americans felt they understood in terms of bipartisanship and such. But there is something about hanging around the party, hanging around the bar a little too long, you know, and people wanting something else. And so I don't know, Bernie's going to win in Vermont until he decides not to.
Yeah.
But I did find that drop off interesting.
He underperformed. Yeah, he underperformed Kamala Harris at a time when like everyone else under Bernie's wing, like the Bernie crats, if you
Right.
will, overperformed the top of the
Right.
ticket.
Right. And so I don't think that's a belief problem for him. If I could bet, I bet that's an age thing. And I think that that is a reminder of the problem with Joe Biden is like it can become a filter for people and then it becomes the most important thing they care about. And so that's the ways I think like a more like healthy or responsive party, particularly at the top of the ticket, has to recognize those type of things and at the minimum directly talk about it. Like remember the week after Biden's debate when he was actually trying to say, yeah, I lost the step, or like, I might do this, but I still whatever. That could have been a premise they were working from a long time, at the minimum of talking to people about the thing that they care the most about him. And they took the opposite route, which was to kind of wave their hands and pretend it wasn't true.
Yeah. One final thing before I let you go was
Yep.
something that I thought was really awesome that you openly stated on the daily when you were on the daily when we talked about the demographics of destiny being like an inherently racist concept that like liberals also believed and that it was just patently untrue, and this election like has openly shown that reality. And I personally really appreciated that you were like, no, it's just racist. And they try to give you an off ramp there to be like, what do you mean by that? You're like, no, it's just racist. And I think that also plays into like the mindset of the liberals in general. I do feel like there is an inherently reactionary way that liberals approach politics. And it's not reactionary in the same way that like conservatives are, right? But it's still ironically reacting to conservatives being reactionary and then retriangulating off of what they're saying. One example that I saw was when Tim Walz was chosen as the vice presidential pick. Republicans immediately were like, "Oh, you guys are so stupid for doing this. Like you're done. Everyone is going to think he's a radical communist. Like we got him." And it's because they genuinely believe that. They genuinely thought that like someone like Tim Walz would be considered too radical, right, for the national campaign, which is ridiculous. And I saw Democrats also respond in almost a similar manner as well, where they were like, yeah, maybe we did mess up by having this like radical guy. And I think Democrats really need to stop talking to or hiring Republicans, because it truly changes the dynamic of the party itself. Like all of this like Lincoln Project stuff, sure, they're like old school fighters or whatever, and they might have been profoundly successful when they were working with the George W. Bush administration. But like, I think that the entire consultant class to a certain degree has been almost completely captured by former Republicans. And you see the ideological remnants of that within the party's messaging, what they're choosing to omit, and how consistently they run scared, and how consistently they try to detangle or decouple, Republican voters in the suburbs and pull them away from the Republican Party's base of support. And I think that there is not only obviously this racial depolarization that clearly happened even in 2016 to a certain degree, and has definitely happened this time around. It frustrates me that the Democratic Party is not looking at the warning signs of their like normal base and just simply relying on, Latinos will always vote for us because the other guy's racist.
Yeah, I mean, Republicans do not care what Democrats say about them. They are completely disconnected from the idea that what Democrats say about what they're doing really matters. And one thing Republicans is work from the premise of their most loyal supporters and basically dare the soft R's to leave them, right?
Yeah.
So they will dare Nikki Haley voters to go vote for Kamala Harris and function, and this is obviously the big impact of the Trump era, and reflect the message and live in kind of the language of their base. The Democrats do not do that. Right, like they work kind of from the opposite premise.
Yeah, they tell the progressives to like, get the fuck out of here.
They tell their base to suck it up for the purposes of appealing to others. And it is not, and it's a choice that I don't like. It's a choice that they have decided to make, but Republicans do the exact opposite. And I think it's also so interesting. And I think there's one caveat I would say in Democrats' favor, which is like their base is more diverse. And so it is a harder task for them to find a unifying issue or find a consistent message across those things. And the Republican task is a little easier because they're more homogeneous. So like I think that's important to say. But to the point about diversity and the kind of assumptions of demographic destiny, like the reason I called it racist, and I believe that, is
Yeah.
like what have we learned over these past 8 years? That Black people also have class concerns, right? Like
Yeah.
that Latinos, like their country of origin matters. Like
Yeah.
that, like all of these things are not actually that revelatory, like the revelatory. Like they are actually kind of basic understandings of
Yeah.
how folks function. And so when we thought about a diversifying country, why did they assume that all those people come here would work in a very specific context? I have some guesses. I really think that Democrats, like my theory here is that Democrats' relationship to race has mostly been defined by African Americans and by a kind of Mexican transition in California.
Yeah.
And because those groups are uniquely American, frankly, and uniquely invested in kind of political structures the way they are, and uniquely democratic, they took lesson from those people and said, of course, if there's more Black people or if there's more Latinos, they act like these two groups.
Yeah.
When, of course not. When we're in El Paso talking to a bunch of Mexican folks there, they're like, why do they keep referencing Miami Cubans? Like, why do they think I care about these other groups? Like, I do not
Yeah.
see myself in a kind of collective group across a diaspora. And so I'm saying the assumption that has undergirded a lot of their beliefs is simply, I think, an impact of treating people like poll respondents and not like full people. Because the difference is the poll will tell you that there's a unified belief among Latinos, right? Like the poll will tell you this or that. But if you actually go talk to those folks, you know that there's a different belief set among those groups. And so, of course, a diversifying nation means different ideas. Like, of course, more Black immigrants will think differently about politics than African Americans who have been here for 100 years, right? Like
Yeah.
the idea that that stuff is a surprise to Democrats just shows how distant they were and how much they took those new arrivals for granted. Because I think for everyone who knows those communities or has been around those communities or grew up in one of those communities, that's a baseline fact. That's a very like normal way to understand things. And so like the only way that like I see that as a new lesson they're learning from Donald Trump beating them twice is their own racism clouding their ability to see
Yeah.
that. And so that's why, and, it's funny because I think sometimes, particularly in like white liberalism spaces that often the New York Times can be reflective of, there's an uncomfort with naming some of that. And I think that it's important to say because it wasn't, I think Republicans, a big change in Republicans from 4 years ago to now is they know now they can pick off some of those voters, right? Like they used to think that those demographic destiny would make them a toast party, that they could never win
Yeah, because
the
they're
election.
racist too. They're
Right. And
outwardly
then they
racist.
realized, and between then and now, one thing that they were telling us in Georgia was like, oh, we don't have to change our message to win these people. Like we can actually bring our message to them. And I think Democrats just weren't ready for a Republican message that wasn't fearful of those people, but targeted them.
Yeah, and it's interesting because like it is inherently white nativist sentiment expressed
Sure.
in a way to present like economic change. It still responds to the economic issues that people are facing. So there's a class component associated with it, but it's actually like inherently a racist, non-class based way of dishing out violence towards a group of people. And it is very revelatory because like with the Haitian migrants with TPS, which Donald Trump himself had actually offered Haitian immigrants as well, and actually re-upped on his way out for Venezuelan migrants, which he shits on now, was this idea that like they also recognize that TPS means proper paperwork. So they're technically not undocumented immigrants, but they communicated about them as though they were. And I think that directly says like, oh, you just think everyone that is an immigrant in the country, paperwork or not, is, undesirable and shouldn't be here. And that regardless of that underlying sentiment, Republicans realize that they can still be like, oh, you know how we're going to fix the housing market? We're going to deport 20 million people. You know how we're going to fix the economy? Deport 20 million people.
Yeah.
Deport 20 million people over and over again. And if the alternative on the other side is to just simply not say that the economy is shit and we have to fix it with like direct action, whether it be an expansion of the welfare state, like the existing welfare state, or tackling price gouging, which was, again, I keep repeating this because that was such a banger of a policy that they just kind of abandoned with the first sign of pushback. That Republicans succeeded in saying we're going to shake up the system with an inherently racist message that was still broadcasted as like an economic solution, and they had no way of combating that. And they thought that it would carry them across the Democrats thought that it would carry them across the finish line to just be like, it stands on its own. It's just racist, right? Like, think about how racist this is. While they also were simultaneously pushing for a watered down version of that exact same principle with their right-wing border bill, which stemmed from the same white nativist attitude towards migration patterns and towards immigrants, born out of right-wing hysteria and panic, and not actual data that shows that, you know, undocumented migrants are actually contributors to the economy and that they are not responsible for a significant share of the crime that Americans are experiencing.
I think you called this out really early, but when, Democrats have, ceded a lot of the ground of this race to Donald Trump's issue of choice, right? They did not stand on the stage and say, what you are doing about immigration, what you're talking about migrants is not factual, and we think that they are contributing, whatever. They were saying, yes, there is a problem. We're just better folks will be a better solution to the problem. And what they did in doing that, I think, was put the race on terms Donald Trump was most comfortable with, and that was certainly a choice that they made. And I just don't. I guess I'm just like, they have to ask themselves whether they want to be a working class party or not, because if I think about the issue that does crawl across their very diverse base, it's money in people's pockets.
Yes.
Do you want to go up against right-wing, pseudo-populism with a left-wing pseudo-populism? Or do you want to try to do some version of racial, gender, sexuality kind of identity markers and try to calm people together on cultural issues? And I guess to me, they have shown that latter is ineffective. What I don't know is if they're frankly willing to try a version of the former. I don't know if that's what they want to do. And so I think that's what the fight that's going to play out over the next year or so. Because I remembered in 2017, after the first shock of Trump's victory, there was so much debate between Democrats about, race versus class. And frankly, I think kind of race won in their message that they ended up saying about Donald Trump, right?
Yeah.
We hear a lot more about white supremacy. But what I think this election shows is the kind of futility of that debate in the first place. It's both. It's always both. It's always and not or. And so they clearly have to find a way to not only speak to people's concerns about, identity in the broader sense, but actually speak to the things that folks are voting on. And they're clearly prioritizing things like the economy, things like money in their pockets. And I think that is a lesson they can take from this week, because that is across racial groups. So if I'm a Democrat, anyone engaging in a kind of it's all race or it's all one thing is not really that serious.
Yeah.
You can't look at that map and say it's all one thing.
Yeah.
And they have to come up with a message that cuts across more of those groups. And I don't see how they can do that without it being kind of, populist driven.
I think that there is an avenue here, which someone who I never would have considered being in agreement with myself, David Brooks, even openly recognized. Your colleague, David Brooks at the New York Times, wrote about the left-wing populism and its necessity and the way that the Democratic Party communicates about things going forward. Now, the wrong lesson to learn here is to abandon marginalized groups in its entirety and then outwardly communicate anti-trans messaging because you're in a panicked state, or just being like racist yourself. And that I'm fearful that that is the lesson that the Democrats are learning. The right lesson is to still be an uncompromising defender and find ways of deflecting the attention when Republicans try to constantly pick apart the, trans panic button, constantly hit that trans panic button. You're like, you don't care about this, and neither do I. These people are our neighbors. You're being weird and gross. Shut up. This is not going to put food on your table. And I think Bernie, while I do have my disagreements with Bernie Sanders, I think that one thing that the Democratic Party broadly and the media as well, to a certain degree, did was they kept talking about his policies, his universal policies, and his left-wing economic populist messaging as though it was like all lives mattering, Black Lives Matter. And I thought that was like very cynical. Maybe some people genuinely believed it, but it was very frustrating because like racial violence oftentimes is dished out on the boundaries of class. Like it's still class violence at the end of the day. I'm not saying that you should abandon Black people. Of course not, right? But I think that at the end of the day, Black people, trans people, Latino people, they're not magical, mystical beings that somehow transcend above the economy and that live in a bubble, right? They still have the same, they still face the same economic pressures. And especially when you talk about like a war against poverty style message, a economic populist message, and you are able to successfully show that you are earnest in this message and that you want to genuinely solve the material harms that they're experiencing, you do actually provide a solution for many of the problems that underserved communities go through. And that, I think, is a message that also will not leave a bad taste in like a lot of people who are maybe, let's say, I want to say like racially incurious, but a lot of people who would normally like when they hear something that is like specifically targeted towards Black people would immediately be like, oh, they don't care about me. They only care about Black people, which is inherently like it's implicit white supremacist ways of thinking. But I think it's like baked into a lot of people's minds because we do live in a white supremacist nation at the end of the day. I mean, its fundamentals are white supremacists, and you see that racist attitude still in every orifice of society and all of our systems. So I think that, like I'm saying, the left-wing populist economic message would not only solve a lot of the underlying problems that every marginalized population experiences, but it's also a very successful method in maybe bringing back some people who automatically feel a level of resentment that whenever you go through the Democratic Party's way of communicating these problems, like, oh, how are we going to win back Black people, Black men specifically? Or we're going to protect Black men's crypto assets if they've graduated from HBCU and have 3 years of work in an underserved community. It's like that's the most insane thing I've ever heard in terms of like any kind of policy. Like that is just, I don't understand. Like, who is this for is what I always ask.
But the thing I would say, and this may be the last thing I say, is like, I think that you come up with those type of galaxy brain solutions when you are avoiding the direct answer, right? If you don't want to talk about poverty, if you don't want to talk about reshaping the way government works, if you don't want to talk about getting rid of money in politics, like the things that I think are like direct answers that you can take to anybody, then you end up coming with these solutions that feel contorted because they are, And I think that if there is something I expect, like, I think that like a person, and I think Bernie's an imperfect messenger on this because I do think he has some uncomfort in people of color spaces. I've seen him in there, and you can tell this is a guy who spends his time in Vermont, right? So I'm saying, like, I think the next version of that, or a better example, because I've been with Rashida Tlaib a couple times in Detroit, and that is someone who I have seen take the same message to every corner of her community, and it is very clear to me why they can't beat her in that district, because that's someone who's been consistent, that's someone who's been authentic, and has taken the same message to lots of different types of groups. And I remember her saying, and this was the time when it was her first run for the race, and it historically had been the John Conyers seat, a historically Black seat, and all this stuff. And she was getting all these questions about is she the right person to hold that seat. And I remember her saying, like, the legacy of John Conyers is justice, is fighting for people, is uncompromising, willing to say what you believe. It's not just being Black. And those are the type of things I think sometimes Democrats need to see and be willing to kind of stand 10 toes down on a belief system. And I think there are a lot of examples to say that voters will reward you when
Yeah.
they feel that level of consistency. And so, like, they have tried to run the Black woman's city council president. They have
Yeah.
tried to, folks have tried to kind of do that there. And I always remember saying to people, I'm like, I'm not saying I don't know if it'll never be successful, but I know that woman, I know that she has like real roots in that space. Like those folks love their congresswoman. And
Yeah.
like that's the work that you got to do. And I think that sometimes there are, particularly when we think about progressives or things like that, there is a faux choice that folks present to say, you can't go to the old Black church and talk about a war on poverty. And I'm
Yeah.
like, who says that? That's not true.
Okay,
Like
the only people that say that
not
have
true.
never been to a Black church in general. So,
I'm saying like you go there, you're presuming something that I don't think is real. And so like I imagine that whoever is the standard bearer for this next version of democratic populism will understand that and will be much more like the type of politicians you've seen coming up than I think the type of politicians who we've had at the national level for a while, whose thinking is still based in a kind of 90s, early 2000s, at minimum, Obama era style of racial politics.
yeah. Astead, thank you so much for coming on. I know I said
Thank
a
you.
couple more minutes, and I just like kept you here for like another 40. But this is always a delightful and very enlightening conversation. Before you go, where did you get your shirt from? Because one, there's a lot of Spurs haters here.
Oh no, I haven't seen the chat. I
Yeah,
did put it on thinking like, let me rep Spurs on this moment. I
yeah.
got the shirt from like a very well targeted Instagram ad, which is a horrible answer. But like if there's one thing I'm a stand on, it's both my journalism and Tottenham. So might as well roll with it.
Yeah.